everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of StreamTime Sports. My name is Chris Stone, I'm the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham. Now, Nick, I'm very excited today. One of my favorite hot topics is what we're going to be deep diving into today, and that's talking about piracy. It's a super relevant topic. I think it's possibly for me one of the most fascinating topics because there's so many different angles that you can dive into it on. And, it's something that more and more people are seemingly, at least in my opinion, starting to talk about, Nick. I remember this is really scary, Nick. In about a couple of weeks, I've been at Sports Pro for 6 years.
Blimey.
I know.
Time flies.
Time really does fly. But I remember those early Sports Pro Madrid summits, OTT summit, as it was called back then. We would do maybe 2 piracy sessions per event sort of thing back then. Really hard to get people into those rooms, but it just feels like over time, like more and more people are starting to talk about it. I think recently, as of June 24th, which was 3 days ago, Javier Tebas, president of La Liga, going out talking about that it's costing the league $600 to $700 million a year. Barney Francis, who used to be at Sky Sports, now at IMG, came out and speaking to the BBC World Business Report, talking about its impending threat on the sports industry, and it just feels like more and more people are talking about it now, Nick. So, we also brought along a guest today, an industry expert, Paul O'Donovan from MediaKind, who's a senior director, product manager. He's going to come and give us a little bit of the other side of the conversation as well. But Nick, with the piracy side of things, like, do you personally, before we dive into it, find it as fascinating as I do?
Yeah, I think with your point or your example around how we saw it coming to life as a topic and how it was always a bit of and I think it still is to some extent a little bit of not a taboo subject, but it's one of these ones that certain people within the industry really jump on and focus on because it's a real thing. And a lot of the data I think we shared recently, even in my recent trip into Sweden, into Stockholm, whereas it came up a number of times, and the scale of IPTV use, illegal IPTV use and piracy is going bigger and bigger and bigger. It's now got to a point where now almost no one can ignore it anymore, whereas I think before there was a little bit of like, it's a problem, we're going to kind of like push it to the side a little bit and not give it much time, just hopefully it'll maybe magically go away. And that is definitely not been the case. And I think an example we may have shared before, but that example that someone used in one of our events a while ago, that in the States, where it was piracy, we've just seen a bit of a wastage, like stock take loss from a supermarket, where it's basically loss of breakage or shoplifting was the comparison, and they just have to accept there's a bit of a loss happening. Well, the problem is that is growing and growing and growing, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel on how to solve it. The pirates are getting smarter. It's getting easier to break down those barriers, and the consumer adoption and use of it is met with any real the negativity that it should be. It's people almost talk about it in such a comfortable manner now, like it's part and parcel of consuming live sports. It's not easily accessible through traditional channels. So it's really interesting to see how it's developed over the last few years and where it's going to get to, because it's clearly, whilst people are talking about it a little bit more in some areas, I feel like we've got a long way to go before we come to any sort of solution or approach, because there's the technical challenges, but also the legal challenges that go along with it. So lots to dig into here. But yeah, Paul's hopefully going to help us, guide us a little bit through this topic, because we only know so much on this, and definitely have views on it, but not to the depths and technical scale that we really should.
Well, I think to that, starting off for you, Paul, is just you've got the opportunity to work with some really some of the biggest sports players around the world. Would you say, Nick and I talking about, we feel like we're seeing more and more of this conversation be brought to light in our eyes, as a B2B media company who runs global events? Are you seeing more of it in terms of, your customers that you're speaking to? Has piracy evolved to the point it's viewed as more of a industrial size threat?
Definitely, yeah. So we've always taken security and content security incredibly seriously at MediaKind, because if we go back historically, a lot of our customers were pay TV operators, broadcasters. So content security was always an intrinsic part of our solution, because it had to be, because we've been securing sports content for 20, 30 years now, just more on the pay TV and broadcaster side. What we've seen more and more over the last 4 or 5 years as sports streaming has become more prevalent is the increase in requirements coming certainly from the bigger tier ones around content security, because they recognize the potential loss of revenue, and secondly, they recognize they also need to keep up with the pay TV operators and the broadcasters on the security side of things if they're going to justify enforcing the rules and regulations they put on them for their content security. They can't be perceived as being hypocritical in that area. I think it's also just worth taking a quick step back to look at, how content is pirated today. If we go back when I was young, 80s, it was you record stuff on a videotape and you might share the videotape with your friends. It evolved in the 90s and noughties to buying a dodgy DVD down the pub. Obviously, I would never have done that, but, I spent time in pubs. I've seen that happen. But that was very much a non-live experience. It was effectively a video-on-demand experience. We've ended up in the world today where, sports is intrinsically a live experience. People want to watch it live. They want to be able to, it's no longer sort of the water cooler moment the following day. It's the social media moment right there. When there's a goal, I want to be able to WhatsApp or Signal or iMessage my friends and talk about what's going on if we're not sat there together. So as a result, content piracy's evolved, and there's just a huge number of different ways of doing it. It can be taking a insecure stream and sharing the playback address. It can be hacking the keys on a fundamentally insecure device, which can be done by a 10-year-old kid with a script they can download off the internet. To add insult to injury, it can be CDN leeching. So not only are people stealing your content, you're paying for them to then view that content. So it's insult to injury. It can be token theft, where account details are either shared around, maybe you share it with your friends or your family, or they're stolen. They're shared on the dark web, and you can buy someone's account details for €1 off the dark web and get access to the platform that way. It can be HDMI capture. Either maybe from a laptop or from a set-top box, or a mobile device with a dongle attached. If you want to get really basic, you can point a camera at a TV and record it that way. Lastly, again, maybe one that's not talked about so much is also accessing content from outside of the region that you're entitled. So it could be that rather than paying for the content in Europe, you pay for the content in India or somewhere else in the world, and as a result, you get access to the content without paying the market rate that you should be. So to then secure this, what do you need? Well, you need DRM. You need to encrypt license keys. You need to check the user is entitled to the content. You need to check the app's entitled to the content. You need to potentially block HDMI output on various devices. You might want to say that on a more insecure device, maybe something which only has level 3 rather than level 1 protection, you want to stream lower quality to those devices. So you need to manipulate, you need to recognize that device, manipulate your manifest, and stream lower quality as a result. You need to check the same account tokens aren't being used thousands of times. You need to block VPNs and access from outside of the country or the region. And there's probably a couple of other things that I've forgotten in there as well. That's just what I can think of off the top of my head. And for many content owners or services, security is just a tick in the box during an RFP. And very often that tick in the box is just, can you do DRM? Yes. Tick. Okay, great. Move on to the next thing. So the end result is that because it's not thought about holistically, because it's not thought about from an end-to-end perspective, you end up having to cobble together various bits of security from many different vendors, and that's where you get the gaps, or that's where you don't cover a specific use case. We believe that end-to-end security looked at in a holistic manner is intrinsic to a successful service, which is what we do. That's our way of thinking on this. So when we then start talking, especially to the larger tier ones, I was at a vendor kickoff meeting 6 months ago with one of our larger customers, and the first topic of the day. So we did all the introductions. We all said hello. We had a coffee and had a chat. First topic of the day after that was our service cannot become a source of piracy for our own content, because they took this incredibly seriously. It was at the forefront of their mind right from the outset. And this was great because it means we can then start architecting from the outset to ensure that happens. What we're seeing very often, maybe with the smaller tier ones, the tier twos, is they don't have that level of focus because they don't have that internal expertise. They don't have someone in their organization who's responsible for the security side of things. So the end result is, because they're not because they don't have that experience, it's not something they think about so much. I was at a prospect recently, a very well-known brand, and they don't even have DRM turned on today. And it's because the incumbent vendor told them it was difficult and expensive. And I'm kind of sat there going, no, it's not. You tick a box and it turns on. That's how it should be in a well-architected and well-designed system. It should be there from the outset. But because there's these perceptions that it can be difficult, it can be expensive, maybe it's not so necessary. Let's focus on things that we do understand. And they understand very well the consumer experience, the attractive applications. That's something which, as a product owner, you can get your head around very easily. And I think that's actually where organizations such as MediaKind can come in and help, is we intrinsically understand the security. We take that headache away from our customers. They can then go off and focus on actually what is the, frankly, exciting stuff, which is, how do you make something really engaging for your fans? How do you make it attractive? And how do you really, really engage with them and delight them with, a service which they want to then go away and watch?
There's multiple things I want to dive into that, but I think sort of maybe where we'll start is, the big question, maybe we can drill down to more specifics, is sort of, where does the blame come? Because I think you mentioned there, live sports is really the crux of it. And I remember, Nick, you got to speak to Rashay McKnight at UFC, talking about, from a legal perspective, a UFC fight might only last 2 rounds. That's 5 minutes. So legally, can you even shut it down in 5 minutes? So is it the legal side of things? And we'll dive into where we think maybe blame could be split around this pie. Not to put words in Peter Scott's mouth, who I think is one of the most intelligent people I've ever spoken to. Back when he was at TNT Sports, he said it'd be the rights holders, because if the rights holders would sell to multiple different broadcast partners, you were just creating more potential chances for your content to get pirated. So it should start at the rights holder. Everyone complains and moans, but it does feel like, specifically, Amazon has been called out. The COO of Sky explicitly called out Amazon. Barney Francis, in the interview I just mentioned, I believe, talks about the Amazon Fire Stick. It does feel like in the last, 12 months, Amazon specifically has been called out. I'm just curious, maybe, Nick, we'll start with you. Do you feel the shift to what seems to be more big tech is to blame? Is that justified?
It's justified. I mean, everyone's pointing fingers in all sorts of different directions. I think if you went back, we've covered it before, but that what came out of the conversation between Syria and beIN Sport was a great example. That beIN said, if you want us to pay exclusive rights deal to you, then you have to make sure that the content is exclusive, and they would stop looking at content being exclusive because of the prevalence of piracy, and because Syria wasn't taking enough steps at the rights owner level to mitigate some of those risks that needed to be taken to protect their asset that they were paying a premium for. Amazon's an easy one to point out because of the conversation around, I don't remember what they call, like Fire Sticks and so forth, which have become quite prevalent around IPTV use and so forth. But that is only one aspect of it. I don't think, even if you turn that, you can point fingers as much as you like at Amazon, but they're not the only part of the piece of the puzzle that's causing all of this, from what I can see. There's a lot of other aspects. And even if Amazon found a way to stop that, which I'm not sure how easy that would be, people would just turn to other more cloud and online based solutions instead of that. Would be my guess in theory. I'm sure Paul might have a bit of a view on that.
Yeah, I mean, the Fire TV one, I find it quite an interesting conversation. Let's be quite clear: the fault lies with the pirates. They're the one who would, they're the ones who are enabling this, and the rest of it is sort of a wider conversation. I mean, the Fire TV to me is very much like the dodgy DVD sold down the pub. It's not the fault of the DVD manufacturers or the DVD recorder manufacturers. It was the people who were selling them down the pub. The Fire TV, I think, gets blamed because it's a very convenient, low-cost dongle that you can buy for 20, 30 pounds, dollars, euros, choose your currency unit. And it's very easy to sideload applications that the pirates have developed on there and then make that available to people who choose to buy them. But if it wasn't a Fire TV, it would just be another low-cost device. Android open source is intrinsically allows you to load whatever applications you want on there. It just so happens that a Fire TV is a cheap, readily available device for people to buy. So, short of locking down the device completely to prevent sideloading of applications, which I think many people who are would object to because they justifiably want to sideload applications onto their devices. There's the whole talk now about opening up app stores on the Apple ecosystem because people want the right to put the applications they want on the devices they've purchased. So, short of completely locking that down, I'm not really too sure what Amazon can do with the Fire TV. I'll hold my hands up. I'm not the best educated on this one. Maybe there's people out there who have some thoughts on this. Maybe that's a topic for a future podcast. I don't know. I'd love to hear them myself, but certainly from my view, it's a convenient thing to blame, but it doesn't fix the underlying problem of piracy.
And as Paul, you sort of set the scene, there is a countless different ways of pirates to be able to get access to the content, and therefore, you just turn off one. You plug one leaky hole in the bucket, then another hole will explode somewhere else along the way. Paul, you mentioned a whole host of different ways and measures that need to be taken to protect content, protect live content in particular. Can you give us a sense of which ways are the most prevalent or the ones that are dominating the way that this content is being pirated? Is there one that really stands out, or is it pretty broad across the whole spectrum that you ran through earlier?
I mean, the main one is DRM because that's the one which is generally the easiest one to implement, with a couple of exceptions for maybe some vendors who are not so experienced in that space who find it a bit more challenging because they don't come from the video background. CDN tokenization is very, very popular as well. The big CDNs, the Akamai's, the Fasties, etc., have some good add-on services there that you can implement. And that seems to be the next one, which is generally used by the customers and prospects that we're talking with. Bringing on top of that, this is where we really come in, looking at this from a holistic perspective, is the entitlements check. Either checking that the application is a valid application, and also checking that the user themselves are actually entitled to the content. I think very often the challenge you have there is that when people are going out and doing RFPs, they'll go to a platform vendor, they'll go to a streaming vendor, they'll go to a security vendor, and they'll have to then bring these various components together. And as a result, starting to run those entitlement checks in conjunction with the streaming vendor gets quite tricky because it's not an easy thing to integrate. We've gone down the route of offering this as a holistic solution because we want to make sure that we can layer these additional security checks on for our customers to really secure the content. The more checks you can have, the more the more you can protect the content. But generally, it is DRM to start with, CDN tokenization, and then we start to layer additional checks on top of that. Many other services out there will just stop with DRM license checks, and they may then start to look at things like key rotation for live content. That's again an interesting topic to go into. Some people view it as an absolute necessity. Other people view it as, if it's live sports content, it's only really going to be up and running for 2 hours. By the time you've rotated the keys, is it really something that's worth doing in an event-based streaming ecosystem? There seem to be two very polar opposite schools of thoughts there, I think, depending on what people want to sell on any particular day of the week.
Well, I've got a bit of a side question here, Nick. That I asked Steve when Steve and I did a Piracy podcast, and it got some people a bit fired up on LinkedIn. And the question I asked was, I used the metaphor, if a tree falls in the woods and no one is there, does the tree make a sound? And the question I asked Nick was, if no one is broadcasting it, is it still piracy? The point I was making is like college football in the UK until very recently, where TNT's picked up something, it wasn't broadcast at all. So the idea is,
in the market, the market you're in.
Correct. Yeah. So if no one's broadcasting in your market, is it still piracy? I think the answer is yes, but there's some people got fired up.
There's definitely a yes. Yeah. There's definitely a yes, but whether it's more understandable why people would who are desperate top tier fans look for a way of finding it. I could appreciate that perhaps more. And it is kind of mad in this day and age that there's still rights out there that haven't been segmented away from major rights deals that don't just make that stuff available. Now, I know I've spoken to some rights owners and they're just like, oh, it's just such a minor audience set. We just don't bother doing it. And I was like, this day and age, I think you could probably be smarter with that approach, or a little bit more strategic. Then it's just not worth the hassle because of all the markets that you might be still able to reach. And you put all those collection of audiences together, then you should be able to get something meaningful out of that audience reach that you wouldn't otherwise have. So I do find it surprising this day and age there is still lots of dark markets for pretty well-known sports with pretty high revenues that they aren't willing to just make sure it's democratized somewhat. Maybe because of the fears of what we've been talking about. Maybe that is part of it as well. They don't want to have it available in certain markets because they know that might open up the doors. I'm not too sure.
I think, Nick, on that front, there's also the team sizes that are available at a lot of the rights holders. I think there's very often the perception that there's lots of people working there, so there must be someone who sat around twiddling their thumbs who can just go away and do this.
Yeah.
And the reality is there's probably not. A lot of the companies that we're talking to, a 4-person team looking at their entire D2C streaming ecosystem and service, 4 people is, a good sized team. For many, it's 1 person, and they're doing it as a side thing for their day job as well,
Yeah.
So I think a lot of this is often down to the team sizes that are available in there. And also, there is the risk of, if you put this content out there, can it actually be a profitable service? Is this something we can make money on? Because if not, and you then have to pull it, or you're going to have people even more upset in that situation. So I think the increasing simplicity of launching D2C services is fantastic. The ability to get the content out there is great, but you do also need to consider when having that conversation is, okay, exactly how can this content be monetized? And obviously, Eric Ramberg, when he was on the podcast with you, talked a lot about advertising and, what can be done there. There's also additional, conversations maybe about what can be done to help with, with sponsorship. Can you add additional value to sponsors? But fundamentally, these services have to be profitable in order to make them viable. And I think that's where a lot of the concerns coming in is once the content's out there, we have to ensure that it remains out there and is a profitable service for them.
So, Paul, in that example, let's say you've got a client who's, let's say, maybe tier 2 level, kind of not right at the pointy end, but has got different types of relationships and different types of access available in different markets. They are looking at the prospect of like, okay, actually, we want to be available globally in all 200 plus markets, depending on what you define as a market. The perception would be that for certain sports, is if they're already producing a feed of content and so forth, that it would be relatively straightforward, not too expensive, to just open up the doors of access, so to speak, to be available, let's say through your own OTT product as an example, be available in every market from there onward. That would be the perception. Just what are some of those challenges then? How is cost like linear in that instance of that market by market that you're adding to it, or is there more of a, the more markets you open up, does it become more cost effective for some reason? I'm just curious on that mix, if that makes sense as a question.
I think the more markets you're in, the more cost effective it becomes, because the more subscribers you will have, and there's always some kind of intrinsic base cost or base fee of launching these services and having them in market. And the more subscribers you have, the more you can amortize that cost across more subscribers. I think what we're generally seeing is the challenge of removing the friction to access. So they need to ensure that they are working with a vendor or a platform that has the flexibility to create a large number of different packages to address different consumers in different countries. So, for example, in one of our customers, they are a tier 1, but there's no reason a tier 2 couldn't do this, has over 2,000 SKUs or packages available globally to allow them to address a global audience. You want to have different pricing options in different countries. You might want to have different tiers of packages in different countries to entice people to come on board. You then start to need to look at how you can incentivize people to sign up. So, is it a free month when you sign up? Is it maybe a free weekend of content? Is it things like live look-in that we recently launched with one of our customers, where you can watch the first 10 minutes of the game for free, and then if you want to keep watching, you pay? There's a variety of different things out there that can be done, but in order to do that, you need to have a very flexible and nuanced set of entitlements. And that's something which, again, technically very similar to doing streaming at massive scale, very similar to securing your content. That's something which is quite a difficult thing to do if the underlying architecture in your platform and ecosystem isn't done well. So again, this is another set of requirements in your RFP process you need to consider. It's not just how can you help me launch in one market at one price, it's how can you help me launch in 50 markets with 10 different prices with a different set of features and functionality in each of those markets, so that I can then tune my pricing or tweak things to really reach the price point that works in those markets. And that then goes back to the security and piracy side of things of, well, once you've got all these different packages out there, how do you stop someone in the UK accessing the package that's available in Indonesia or India or Nigeria, which is lower cost with maybe with less functionality? Again, that then comes down to entitlement checks, that comes down to geo-blocking, that comes down to VPN blocking. So you're adding a whole other amount of work on top of that. And if you're Bob or Barry from, whose main job is as a broadcast engineer, and you're doing this as your side job, you don't have the capabilities of doing that. So they need to ensure they're working with vendors who have that intrinsic capability and can manage it for them to ensure that all these packages are out there and available, and working with their marketing team to get the content out there in a way that it can be accessed, but also that it's done in a way that then makes sure the content is fundamentally secure and only accessed by the people who have the rights to it.
So are you saying that Simon Jordan's claim that the Premier League could just easily set up a D2C platform and make billions and billions of dollars wouldn't actually be that easy?
I don't think it would be that easy. I mean, I think anyone who's listening to this podcast who's been around in the industry for a while knows that nothing is ever that easy. But yeah, I think it could be done if they wanted to. It's
not overnight, though.
It would need to be done in a way that, had given Premier League content is incredibly valuable, it would need to be done in a way that is, I think, security first, ensures they protect their content, and also ensures that they're holding themselves to the same standards that they hold their broadcast partners to.
Yeah, and there's no question that there's a market for it. Of all my travels there, everyone, Premier League is being consumed one way or other right across the globe, and there's inevitably a pretty massive opportunity there if that's unlocked. I'm curious, Paul, to take it a step further from the tier ones, because often piracy is typically mainly associated with the tier ones, and I think rightfully so, because they're the needle movers when it comes to consumption. How far down Do you think and see that the need to manage piracy through end to end is essential? Is a smaller tier 3 sports media set of rights or an outlet or a platform, do they have to treat it with the same needs and the same parameters as, say, a tier 1, or is there, because the demand's not to that scale, you wouldn't put that amount of effort into it or that amount of breadth into it?
I think a lot of it comes down to the intrinsic value of the content as well. To secure content, there is always some kind of intrinsic cost. I think what we generally see is that if a league or a club doesn't take it seriously from the outset, and then they then start to get more and more successful, and they start to get more and more subscribers and more viewers, at some point in the future, they're probably going to have a problem. And they've then got a choice 2 or 3 years down the line. Do we just hold our hands up and say, oh, this is going to be a problem for us, and they take the financial hit? Do they re-platform, which is, definitely an option, but that requires a significant amount of time and effort? Or do they think about it from the start and work with vendors who intrinsically understand this, and they can then turn on the features they want as they need them? They may choose just to start off with nothing. Maybe they're not particularly bothered if their content's getting stolen to start with. I was talking to a potential customer recently. They're like, yeah, we don't really particularly mind because it gets more people interested in the sport. So they're actually, bizarrely enough, reasonably happy with a little bit of piracy because it gets the sports out there. But at some point, yeah, they're going to want to start to turn DRM on as things get more popular, because they're going to want to start securing the content. Then further down the line, they're going to want to start layering on more and more security options as they start taking it more and more seriously. So the choice is really there is, do you not care about it from day one and focus on other things and potentially give yourself a big headache in 2, 3, 4 years' time? Or do you, start working with vendors from the outset who actually understand this and can turn on the features and functionality you want when you need them? I would tend towards the second. Obviously, I'm highly biased because that's what we do. So obviously, I'm bound to say that. But even when we're talking to the smaller tier 2s and the tier 3s, none of them come to us and say, oh, we're doing this because we've got 20,000 subs and we want to keep them happy. They're always coming to us and saying, we've got 20,000 subs, and in 5 years' time, we want to have 100,000 or 500,000 or 1 million. Everyone comes to us with grand aspirations. That's why they're doing this. They're not doing this to sit still. They're doing this to grow. So if you're doing this to grow, then you need to think long term. You need to make sure that you're planning for 5 years' time when you've got 20 times as many fans on your platform.
And so, just Paul, so that basically comes down to, I think you've explained it pretty well, but I just want to surmise it, is effectively, if you have aspirations to grow, but you don't set up your own platform effectively, you will basically risk you have to re-platform and rebuild it again effectively, or close to, if you don't have just the construct set up from day one to at least be able to turn on those levers as and when you want.
Yeah. And look, we quite like customers out there who want to do that, because there's quite a few that we're talking to right now who've been in the market for a number of years with competitive solutions, and they've been very happy with them up to a point, and they're now coming out into the market and running RFPs to re-platform because they recognize they've got to the point where they want to grow further, they need to secure their content more. And as a result, they're talking to us. So, I'm never unhappy when someone wants to re-platform. It's good for our business. But equally, if you choose a vendor from the outset who helps you secure that long-term vision, that makes your life simpler in the long run as well.
So I'm going to, change this direction a little bit. And, we keep hearing people talking about piracies costing hundreds of millions of pounds, $100 million, whatever currency you want to do. More, yeah. 28 billion. Is that what the number I think gets floated? I can't remember
the last numbers, but it was in the tens of billions, I think.
Yeah, I think 28 billion is the number that gets flown around from time to time. But one of the things behind that is they're talking about, it's costing the broadcasters, and that's costing the rights holders, and it's this overall negative. And my opinion, Nick, and I mentioned this when we were talking about this, is I think sometimes we look at piracy as an illness, whereas I view piracy as more of a symptom. It's just one part of a larger thing. That there's so many games that aren't on TV that are available. The stuff that is on TV is incredibly expensive, and then you look at it beyond there. Try to go to a Premier League match or an NFL match in particular in person. The cost of tickets are just extortionate. We've talked about the FIFA Club World Cup, how expensive it was to go to a game there. I don't know what the travel sports situation's like in the UK, but I can tell you in the US, parents are paying thousands of dollars for little Johnny to go play baseball, soccer, things like that. Sports feels like it's never been more inaccessible. And I think sometimes we talk about what's the solution to this. I think, Nick, you and I are probably a bit on board with, I don't know if technology can solve this. It's not that there aren't vendors out there that are coming up with really clever and creative ways to disrupt piracy, but I don't know if that's really looking to the root of the problem. I think, Nick, we've talked about it, and Paul, you alluded to it a little bit, talking about advertising. Is that really, Nick, in your opinion, not saying it's going to be easy, not saying it can be done overnight, but does it have to stop being trying to stop pirates and more focusing on how the monetization of distribution is? And I know that's a very big question, big ask, Nick, but do you feel like we're getting more and more that way?
I think it does come down to the root cause of that approach. And obviously we look towards the music industry and video entertainment world, which has gone through its own journeys. And inevitably that was how it got to a point where it had to be, the model had to change for it to be viable and for basically piracy to not be as prevalent and as valuable anymore in the eyes of the consumer. So inevitably, that seems like the most logical route to reduce the need and the impact that piracy does have. But we've still got a long way to go to get to a place where that is achievable. And in both, in the instance of music, it was only because Spotify found a way to bridge that. But I watched I don't think it's a documentary. It's like one of those shows which is based on a true story, but it is dramatized. I'm not sure what the name of that is. It's actually a Swedish series, and it's basically on Spotify's journey. And that was the first time I really came to a grasp of the understanding how the difficult bit was the negotiation of rights deals and relationships with the distributors and the producers, the companies that own basically all the music. It wasn't just creating a platform and even doing rights deals with the musicians themselves. And I think sports has got that similar predicament where these rights, the way that rights are approached now and today, how do you retrofit all that to get everyone on board? And Spotify had to go through a lot to find a way to get everyone to get on the boat, so to speak. So I think that's going to be really, really tricky. But I think it's the only real way that piracy would ever have a true sort of what would you call it, like an end point, I suppose, to what it's doing now in sports. So, and for now, it's just going the other direction. There is no light really at the end of the tunnel there. I think what Paul and MediaKind and lots of other companies are doing is to try and mitigate and reduce those losses and impact, and really slow down that impact or minimize as much as possible. And that's all we can really be thinking about now, rather than trying to say, hey, we're going to solve it. No one is going to solve it magically.
I think there's also a perceived value for fans as well. So if the cost is being perceived as expensive, that often just means that people aren't actually seeing they're getting value from the service that they're accessing. And again, this is something we saw in an RFP recently, where I think it was third on the list of their requirements or their challenges was there's a service in market today, but it's being perceived by the fans as being expensive. So, how do you handle that? Well, if you can give them more value for money, if you can give them additional features and functionality, they're more likely to actually think, oh yeah, I don't mind paying for this because I'm getting value for money. I don't mind paying $10.99 a month for Netflix because I perceive it as good value for money. So it's also, what can you do in that area to, give fans the perception of value for money? Obviously, great content is a starting point. Having the event available is one thing. But then it's other things like, okay, highlights. Are the highlights available on there? Are they available immediately after the match? As a fan, Can I go in and rewatch the game if I've missed it immediately as soon as it finishes, or am I having to wait 3 or 4 hours? If I've got to wait 3 or 4 hours, that's not good. We've recently introduced multi-view with one of our customers, which is available on all their consumer devices, including smart TVs, which is something that traditionally wasn't available because the devices didn't have the processing power. And the result is that they've seen a huge reduction in their amount of churn, because all of a sudden consumers are getting what was previously a premium high-end feature on all of their devices. So it's a nice way for them to interact with the sports they're watching, and they really, really like it. I think the other one, and again, this comes down to perceived value, and I think also a degree of anti-piracy, is video latency. So if we think historically, video latency on streaming was 20, let's say 20, 30, 40 seconds, probably 30, 40, 50 seconds. So all of a sudden, you're way behind the live action, especially comparing that to a broadcast platform. So, you're delayed there. If you've got, say, a friend who's watching on the broadcast platform, they've texted you or WhatsApped you or signaled or telegrammed or iMessaged you about or you've seen it on X or whatever before you've even seen the goal on your platform. So again, it's like, I'm paying all this money for this, but I'm learning about the goal from social media or the overtake or whatever event it is. So actually, by bringing down video latency so it's broadcast equivalent or better, all of a sudden that you're ahead of social media, you're viewing the action the same time as your friends, the buddy you've got who's actually lucky enough to have got the ticket to the game, that you're seeing it so quickly after they've seen it that all of a sudden you can have the interaction. So there's then the perceived value that you're getting a high value service as well. So there's additional things that can be done to add value to the service so that people are then not so concerned about paying the money they are.
I think that's a really great example, and it got me thinking. The one big subscription service I pay for from a sports perspective is the NFL Game Pass. For me, Sky's obviously got it on there. I've got access to Sky, but I want to specifically watch the Cincinnati Bengals. So part of it is I can watch the team I want. It's also got NFL Red Zone, which I argue is maybe the best sports product in the world. But the feature that's really important for me that I want to pay for is I've gotten older, the less likely I am to watch the Bengals play a Monday night game where they're going to break my heart. So there's no point in me staying up till 5 a.m. What I think Delta Trade initially put into the platform and DAZN's carried on, which is where I get value, is to your point, being able to watch the game afterwards. And not only do they have the full game replay, they also do a 40-minute recap where it's literally from one play ends, next play ends. There's no commercials. There's nothing else. And for me, my travel time into work is about 45 minutes. So the fact that I can wake up, download the game on my phone so that I don't have to worry about being on the tube, no service, and I can watch the Bengals game the night before, it's what you're talking about right there. It's an additional layer of service or features that then all of a sudden I don't mind the cost that I'm paying, because it's not a cheap subscription, but it has enough features within it, and particularly that download the game from the night before. It's an incredible feature for me that justifies the cost that I spend on it.
Yeah. I think also, we touched on advertising earlier, and I think that's probably quite an important topic to talk about. I think Eric when he did the podcast with you, he talked around the challenges of doing advertising at huge scale, how you deal with the thundering herd of 100,000 or 1 million people or devices all needing to see a targeted advert at the same time, and how you handle that. So once you've got over the intrinsic technological challenges, you then start to get onto the value-based challenges of how do you ensure that all your ad spots are filled. How do you make sure that you're maximize that ad inventory so that you can maximize your revenue and offer it to as many consumers as possible? And again, that's a conversation which is, I think, anyone who's thinking about ad-funded services should be having with the vendors they're talking to, because there's multiple solutions there around working with multiple ADSs, the support of pre-sold and programmatic ads, utilizing house adverts, working across device-specific ADSs, all sorts of lovely stuff there. But what's often then not talked about is what you can do with the same technology to add additional value to sponsors. Because very often, sponsors are looking either for more value, or you have the opportunity to, add sponsorship inventory. So, can you use the same text so that when someone tunes into a live game, rather than it going straight into the live game, you splash up the sponsor logo or a 3 or 5 second sponsor message. You want something unintrusive. You don't want it to be the situation where someone hits play and they want to go to the live game and they're sat there watching a 30-second pre-roll advert, getting angrier and angrier and losing their perceived value because they're missing the action. But something 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, most people will accept that. So there's additional value that can be brought there from a sponsorship perspective, which I think is also something very, very important. And the great thing is the same underlying tech can deliver this, so long as you have things architected in the right way.
Paul, you mentioned ADSs. So for those that don't know, that's I guess that's a addressable advertising system. I think is the term.
Ad decision
right?
server, yes.
Ad decision server, one of that. But basically helps serve more personalized advertising into connected TVs and streaming experiences. Is that basically
that's it? So rather than showing the same advert to everyone, you can target it. Maybe at a per region level, per country level, per city level, right the way down to Paul, Chris, and Nick would all see a totally different advert based on likes, dislikes, or what they know about us from a data perspective.
And that targeted nature, how far along do you think we are with that being adopted and used effectively, particularly around sports? Is it prevalent?
It's pretty prevalent today with the larger sports leagues. I think what's good for a consumer is when it's done well, they shouldn't even know they're being targeted. Very often, unfortunately, it's done badly, so it goes to an ad break and the video stutters, and you get a little buffering thing whilst everything works itself out. But when done well and when done properly, which is an area of huge focus for us, it's transparent to the user, so they don't even necessarily know or recognize they're being targeted with an advert. So the other good thing there is, generally the more targeted the advert, the more revenue you'll get. Showing a general broadcast advert, it has value, but it means lots of people who are going to have no interest in it are going to end up seeing it. So you get paid less. If you can really target that advert to people who are going to be wanting to be interested in the product, means you can get more money. And it means effectively you can segment your audience and you can then start to target them. I think the great thing with sports is, if you're streaming, if you've got people who are watching motor racing, they've probably got an interest in motorbikes or motor cars. That's a fairly safe bet to sort of have that kind of advertising on there. So I think sports, especially, lends itself very well to targeted advertising, specifically because you've got people who are very interested in a specific topic.
And then I think one of the last things that I was going to talk about a little bit, Nick, here, just talking about the impact of media rights deals. I think, we look at some of that stuff has maybe been flatlining a little bit in Europe. And I think we've even seen, the example with DAZN and Ligue 1. They, reference, rampant piracy being part of the reason that DAZN no longer wanted to engage, whether that's the real reason or not. It was, I think it was, listed out there as one of them. I think back to when I joined the company, BLQ was a big thing. And I think that had some impact over some different negotiations and things like that. But if piracy continues to be as rampant as it is, Nick, do you think that, how big of an impact do you think that actually does have? Or do you think, exclusive rights are going to be impacted by the legacy or the perceived impact of piracy?
Oh, there's no question. I think it's already having a big impact, and it can only get bigger and bigger. And I think when you couple that with the changing consumer habits that exist, the role that Netflix and streaming platforms have, the role that YouTube has in being entertainment for people to consume and having it at a click of a button with ease of access and no cost associated, not as a direct cost associated. There is some sort of value being shared depending on if it's advertising led or not. I think it's only going to make it harder and harder for rights owners without really investing effort into piracy to blocking piracy and mitigating piracy, that it's going to become more and more of a challenge for them to get those rights deals if they're not really tackling this head on and finding ways to do everything they can to mitigate the impact, working with Paul and his team as an example, and also working more collaboratively across the wider industry to try and find other ways to, I don't know, find better tactics to try and continue to get a little bit closer to, I guess, the pace of movement you see in the piracy world. If they can, it's a bit like when we started seeing doping in sports, right, where they always said that the scientists were always ahead of the testing. I feel it's a bit of that. We need to find a way to try and bridge that gap and narrow this gap of trying to like chase the pirates and the new ways that they can do things and try and get ahead of the curve somehow. I know that sounds right, Paul, to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've actually got a question, I think, for you, Nick and Chris, is, given the state of the market with piracy at the moment, do you think the exclusive media rights broadcast deals are still viable?
Yeah, I would say that they are still. I mean, it's a really weird industry right now, where you've got some of these tier ones are generating insane growth levers, but like in the US especially, because I believe it's actually driven heavily to do with the advertising landscape and the growth of that. We talked to a lot of streaming and major tech companies in New York at our event there, and they're all so focused on using live sports as that advertising sales tool to drive huge revenues. That on top of the subscription value it provides, but advertising is really the next outlet. We've seen other sports across the world outside the US that growth is flatlined significantly. A lot of sports properties are having to give more to keep the media rights values at a level. Premier League was one of those examples last cycle where they had to give a lot more games in the package to try and ensure that Sky and others weren't willing to step away from the big checks that they've been paying them for some time. At some stage, if they keep pulling away the layers to it, they're going to run out of layers to be pulling away to try and keep those revenues up, and it's going to make it really difficult. So I think that's why they have to be looking at more distribution channels, more ways to get to market, their own OTT channels being much more a key part of it. And other distribution partnerships they can do to just make sure they're maximizing the reach of their content. But that means along with that is a shift away from just pure rights deals to other ways of monetizing, like you pointed out, Paul, around advertising and sponsorship as a way, which is growing. The sponsorship industry is growing digitally, but it needs to grow even faster if it's to shift the industry along with it.
Yeah, and I agree with Nick. I think it's going to be too difficult to just exclusively work with one or two partners, which I feel is what you see in the majority in the UK. I'm a massive fan of free to air. I appreciate, we've talked about this, the NFL is king because it's largely free to air and its advertising model. I understand you can't do the same thing for the Premier League because the games aren't structured with the amount of stops and starts where you can just insert an ad. But I'd be pretty willing to bet if you went out to most people in the UK and you said, hey, you'll be able to watch the Premier League for free, but every 15 minutes we're going to have a 30-second in-game ad where we're going to cut the commentary for the game to run some sort of small ad. I think most people would be willing to do that in comparison to having to pay what they're currently paying for Sky and everyone else. And I think I've done it where I think only like 52% of games are currently live. Now that'll change next year when they increase the amount of games, but I do think to Nick's point, I would love to see YouTube. I know Rob Pilgrim said that the UK and European markets are different than the US. I'd love to see the rollout of like a YouTube TV type of thing over here. But yeah, I agree with Nick. I don't think long term it's viable to stay with the system it is, particularly if they're going to keep blaming piracy as much as they are. So with that, Paul, I do appreciate you coming on today. It is nice to hear from the other side because Nick and I can typically talk about what we think, but it's nice to hear someone that actually has to work in and actually combat, piracy hand to hand. And you've got insights from your clients. And it is good to hear that they are prioritizing piracy now in those conversations that you're having. So we really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation with us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a lovely conversation.
Thanks, Paul.
Now, before you go, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate and review and just let me know what you think on social. You can find me on most social platforms as SportsPro Nick. And please do spread the word of the podcast. There's no better way of marketing than word of mouth, whether that be in person or on social media. And if you don't like what you've heard, or you think we should be doing more or less of something, then reach out and let me know, as I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Streamtimers. Until next time.